Hello, I'm Cathy Olds again, and I'm here to talk about the development of spiritual direction. This is the second video. The first one we talked about the origins of spiritual direction in the early church, especially among the desert fathers and mothers, and then how that leads to the development of monasticism. We talked about how much of that spirituality was lay spirituality at the beginning. We'll continue with some of that theme as we look at the growing development of spirituality and especially spiritual direction. What happens and where we're going today is how spiritual direction is developed, particularly in Celtic cultures, and how Celtic Christianity took that practice of spiritual direction from the desert mothers and fathers and developed it for a wider audience. So much of what we understand today about spiritual direction and what it is and how we do it comes from that Celtic experience of Christianity in the 5th and 6th century, which is understood as the golden age of Celtic spirituality. To say something about the context for this development, Celtic Christianity, as all Christianity, is lived within a culture. Of course, Christianity develops in a Roman and a Jewish culture to begin with. And then of course, the Romans come into England well before the time of Jesus. You've got Roman influence there, but they never get to Ireland, which has one of the reasons for the differences for the development of Celtic Christianity. So we basically say that Celtic Christianity is developed in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the Isle of Man. And it develops a bit differently. First of all, pagan Irish culture is thoroughly religious. There's a value of nature. Both men and women have significant roles. You have both male and female gods, much as in the Roman pagan culture. But there's this emphasis on natural elements like the sun, like trees, like springs and wells. There's also a very tribalness to Celtic culture. So Celtic peoples live in tribes, in clans, rather than in villages. And there's a value for poetry and song and storytelling and celebrating heroes. You look at what we have from the time before Christianity is introduced into Ireland, and many of the stories are about the kings and the great heroes, the great warriors of the clans of Ireland. So that's some of the context. So what happens, of course, is Patrick is among the first. He is not the only one. He's not the first, but he is probably one of the most successful of the Christian evangelizers. So, of course, many of you know his story. He's abducted by Irish raiders from the west coast of England and is brought to Ireland as a slave, escapes, and then returns to Ireland to convert the people of Ireland to Christianity. So he becomes one of those first Celtic heroes. There are many. Some of them we recognize in our Roman list of saints, but if you go to Ireland, they celebrate many different Irish saints there. So Patrick is among the first. He's followed by Bridget of Kildare, St. Bridget, St. Kieran of Clonmacnoise, St. Finian, St. Brendan, Columba or Columcille of Iona, which is off the Highlands of Scotland. Kevin of Glendalough is another one that you might be familiar with, and then Aidan of Lindisfarne on the east coast of England. These are all some of those great Celtic saints of this golden age of the 5th and 6th centuries. So they celebrate these different saints, and one of the reasons is because they have taken on a lifestyle very similar, and were very influenced by the desert fathers and mothers of Egypt. And of course, there aren't deserts in Ireland. It's green, lush country, and very connected to the sea. So, what many of these heroes do, these spiritual heroes, is they become hermits on the edges of the country. If you have ever heard of Skellig Michael, which you see in the later Star Wars movies, it's a very barren, rocky island that's out in the sea, in the Atlantic Ocean. And they built these rock huts, what they call beehive huts, on the west coast of Ireland and on Skellig Michael. And these became, cells that were similar to, the cells of the mud huts in the desert of Egypt. So you have this transfer of the desert spirituality of Egypt to Ireland. And that has an impact on how Christianity develops, because people hear about these great saints, these hermits, these holy people, and they come to them just as they did in Egypt. So what develops differently is many of these heroes, Bridget included in Kildare, Kieran in the center of Ireland at Clonmacnoise, developed these monastic cities. So because Ireland is this clan culture, you don't have monasteries separating themselves from society. You have these monastic cities becoming these great centers of culture. So you have, like in Kildare, you've got monastery for men and a monastery for women right next to one another, and around them you have villages, or a village that helps support that monastery. But you have the lay people who attend mass and receive the sacraments at the monastery, because there are no parishes, there aren't the villages, there aren't the cities like there are in Europe. So you have these great monastic centers. One of the largest is Clonmacnoise in the center of Ireland, founded by Kieran, and there's over 1,000 people in this monastic city, and maybe half of them, if that much, are actual monks. So you have a sense that this is much bigger and much different than a monastery in, for example, a Benedictine monastery in Italy. So you've got this development of this monastic system connected to these spiritual heroes. Many of these heroes would spend time in the city, in the monastic city, but then I'll go off to their beehive hut to be alone and to pray. And they would do that for weeks or months at a time, and then come back into the monastic city. But you've got that kind of dynamic going on. You have what's called a green martyrdom, which is a focus on the ascetic life. So this type of monasticism is very similar to the Desert Fathers and Mothers and those who followed them in Egypt. So there's this ascetic life that you eat bread and water alone, you don't sleep a whole lot, you pray the Psalms standing in the ocean. And we're talking the Atlantic or the North Sea. In the case of Iona, so you're in the Sound of Iona, off the coast of the Highlands, and Columba would go there to pray the Psalms, as an ascetic practice. So you don't have a parish structure until the High Middle Ages in Ireland. So we're talking 11th century, and we're still back in the 5th century. So you've got quite a long time before the parish system, is brought to Ireland. So this monastic spirituality has an impact on lay people and how they live their Christianity. It is very community focused, again, because Irish culture was very community focused, very clan centered. You have this development of soul friendship, or soul love, which in Irish is anam cara. You may have heard that term. So you've got monastic leaders that take care of not just monks, but monk and lay people alike. You have a practice, these practices of the Desert Fathers and Mothers that call for spiritual guides. It's understood that these spiritual leaders of these monastic centers are to also address the spiritual needs of lay seekers. You have this quote attributed to Saint Bridget that a person without a spiritual guide or a anam cara is like a body without a head. So there's this this understanding in Irish Christian spirituality that anyone who is serious about a spiritual life needs an anam cara, needs a spiritual guide. And it's out of this tradition that the Irish Church develops what we come to know as private confession. So you have this one-on-one connection to this spiritual guide, which is usually a monk or a priest or a nun. It's there as it gets reintroduced into the larger Christian church that private confession becomes a widespread practice. Okay, but that's in the centuries to come. So this understanding again of anam cara as this connection to one other that you can go to talk about your relationship with God, to deepen your spirituality, is what we reinterpret today as our understanding of spiritual direction. So there's a real direct connection to this Celtic understanding of anam cara and our present day practice of spiritual direction. So one of the other practices that comes from Celtic spirituality is pilgrimage, and it's understood a little bit differently than in the European or Roman Church at the time. So in the earliest days of Christianity, there was always this practice of pilgrimage to Rome, and pilgrimage specifically to the Holy Land, to the homeland of Jesus, of course, over the Middle Ages, there's the development of pilgrimage to holy sites and places where saints lived and died, and that's similar in Ireland, but with an important twist. So instead of going to Rome or the Holy Land, the Celtic understanding of pilgrimage was that you leave home and family to preach the gospel. It was called a white martyrdom. The green martyrdom was the ascetic practices, the standing in the cold water to pray the Psalms and eating bread and water and not sleeping and that kind of thing. So St. Aidan gets to the east coast of England because he takes this practice of pilgrimage and leaving home and family to spread the gospel seriously. So he founded this community at Lindisfarne in Northumbria of England to follow this white martyrdom. Again, praying the Psalms is important in Celtic Christianity because they're a poetic people. Poetry is a part of the culture. And the prayers of protection are also come from Celtic Christianity. If you read the breastplate of Patrick or the prayer of St. Patrick or the Deer's Cry, all the same thing. It's this very poetic call on Christ to be our protector and for us to be close to and surrounded by by Christ. There's an emphasis on artistry, the copying and illustrating of the Gospels and the Psalms. The Book of Psalms, like the Book of Kells, becomes an important practice in Celtic Christianity. And again, all of this is taken back into Europe by these green martyrs, or I'm sorry, these white martyrs of Ireland and Scotland, to bring this understanding of Christianity back into Europe in the Dark Ages. So to give you a bit of context, Patrick is preaching in Ireland around the same time that St. Augustine dies. You've got Bridget that follows him in the early 6th century, and then by the time Columba comes, he's in the mid-6th century. So Kevin is mid-7th century, or early 7th century, sorry. So you've got this golden age of Celtic Christianity over the time when the Roman Empire is ending. The last Roman emperor lived in 476. So you have through the after the fall of the Roman Empire, you have monasteries that are developed and standardized, obedience becoming a real important part of the monastic culture in Europe. It's the monasteries that take on the work of educating, and these schools are only for the wealthy. Sometimes you have nobility that attend these monasteries, and again, it's the monks that are the ones that keep the books, the manuscripts from the time before the fall of the Roman Empire. Lay spirituality is severely limited at this time, except in Celtic cultures. And so lay spirituality is often left to how shall I say this, is left to the uneducated clergy. So clergy outside of the monasteries were often illiterate, uneducated. So they took on the work of caring for the people of God on their own, oftentimes governed by a bishop, but not a whole lot of education. You also have later in the High Middle Ages, you have the development of mystics like the Rhineland mystics, Hildegard of Bingen and Meister Eckhart. You have people like Julian of Norwich in England, who is an abbess and anchoress, who gave her life to prayer and lived in a small room connected to the church in the small town of Norwich, England. And there, as Her Holiness became known to the people in England, people would come and talk with her and meet with her and ask her about their relationship with God and how they were to live their spirituality. So she became a spiritual director to many. Catherine of Siena is a great mystic and saint of our church, and she was not a cloistered nun. She served the poor and the sick. The Beguines and Begards of Northern Europe, in what we now know as Belgium, became a lay community, not even an order, of people that would care for the poor and the sick. And they were oftentimes widows that would take their wealth and build these neighborhoods of people that would pray together and then serve the poor and the sick. So there are these connections to lay people, and they would oftentimes be influenced, and their spiritual directors were oftentimes clergy. But they were living out this Christian life the best way they knew how. You also have a growth in popular piety with the building of the cathedrals, and a piety and praying to Mary. She became very important during the High Middle Ages among the lay people. But again, there's not a whole lot of one-on-one spiritual direction. That is really limited to monasteries and the clergy. What you have, again, later by the Renaissance and just after the Renaissance, you have the Protestant Reformation and the growth of Ignatian spirituality, which has been, again, made available today to both, Jesuits as well as lay people. They do training of lay people to share Ignatian spirituality. By the 17th, 18th century, you have people like Francis de Sales and St. Vincent de Paul that are developing and act as guides, as spiritual guides to both individuals, and set up these movements of lay people to live a life of service rooted in spiritual growth. So you have many of these saints that are writing letters to individuals, and not just to religious and to monasteries and convents, but to lay people. You have St. Clare of Assisi writing letters to a lay woman to discuss spirituality. And so you have these different saints that are acting as spiritual directors. And of course, connected with St. Francis of de Sales is Jane de Chantal, who sets up, who is a mother who ends up becoming a sister and setting up a religious order of women. By the 20th century, early 20th century, you have Thomas Merton, who takes monastic spirituality and the tradition of spiritual direction and makes it available to the laity through his writings. And then, of course, in 1962-63, you have Pope John the 23rd calling the Second Vatican Council to return the church to our founding, to focus us on being people of God, not calling lay people and all Christians to the priesthood of baptism, to the universal call to holiness, to be disciples on mission, to share the gospel. And in order to do that, there's a need for lay formation. And spiritual direction then is taken out of the monasteries and convents and opened up to lay people seeking a deeper personal relationship with God. So you have lay formation being, calling lay people to learn, scripture, to learn theology, and to learn spirituality. And oftentimes in doing that, and lay people working in the church, calling on them to find people to help them deepen their own spirituality in order to do that work. So you have writers like Henry Nouwen and Thomas Merton and Richard Rohr. You have lay communities and classes in spirituality. You have lay associates and oblates to traditional religious orders developing. So in terms of spiritual direction, you have programs